Ben was appointed President and CEO of Living Cities in July 2007. Since that time, his organization has adopted a broad and provocative agenda that harnesses the collective knowledge of its 22 member foundations and financial institutions who are focused on benefiting low-income people in the cities where they live. Living Cities deploys a unique blend of more than $140 million in grants, loans, and influence to re-engineer obsolete public systems and connect low-income people in underinvested places to opportunity. Prior to joining Living Cities, Ben co-founded One Economy Corporation, a nonprofit agency focused on connecting low-income people to the economic mainstream through innovative online content and increased broadband access. Mr. Hecht received his Juris Doctor degree from Georgetown University Law Center and his CPA from the state of Maryland. For 10 years, he taught at Georgetown University Law Center and built the premier housing and community development clinical program in the country. And in 1997, he was awarded the Georgetown Charles Fahey Distinguished Adjunct Professor Award. Quite the credentials, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Ben has to say. And so, welcome, Ben. Let's get started. Living Cities has been around since 1991, and the momentum of your work now has, as I mentioned earlier, has 22 member foundations and financial institutions working together to disrupt status quo approaches to improving the lives and conditions of low-income residents across the U.S. I'm curious about how difficult it was to bring so many powerful and diverse players to a common table to collaborate on this work, and what drove them to join together with you to disrupt cities.
Yes, so thanks. First of all, thanks, Mark, for having me. It's really exciting to be here. I've long been a fan of your work and Tamarack's work, so thank you for having me. I wasn't here at Living Cities at the time of its founding, but I was a fan of it early on. And it was really interesting how it came together, because there were external factors that were sort of pushing this diverse group, foundations on one side and financial institutions on the other, to come together, to work together differently. And on the foundation side, it was the need and the interest in trying to really see how can we turn around neighborhoods. And if you think about the 80s and the early 90s, there was quite a belief that that the neighborhoods were the unit of change that were going to really help people get up and out of poverty. And I think we now know they're important but insufficient to the overall strategies. But the foundations really wanted to take advantage of investing in neighborhoods. And at the same time, financial institutions had regulatory requirements, relatively new, the Community Reinvestment Act, that gave them responsibilities to reinvest depositors' dollars in communities. And there was a new federal law that was the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, which passed in 86. And it was all of these things together that said, wow, there's new federal money that could really land in neighborhoods to improve housing. There's not necessarily the capacity to take advantage of it. And there's a regulatory and financial need of the financial institutions to see that their money lands in the same places we'd like the tax credit money to land, and to build the capacity of these neighborhood organizations. And so it was that confluence of things that came together, largely led by the vision of, at the time, the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, Peter Goldmark, who brought together financial institutions and foundations to start down this path.
So when you think about that diverse group, then, were there particular, was there some storming that went on when you were first starting with them? In terms of getting aligned?
You know, I think of course, you know, and I think it's a constant tension that we have, which is how do you find the sweet spot where what they're doing together is something they really couldn't do on their own. And it's something that we as a collaborative work hard at, which is to say, how do we define, one of our board members, Audrey Choi from Morgan Stanley, coined this phrase for us, and we use it all the time, which is how do we show our differential impact of as a collaborative versus what each of the individual members can do. And so whether that's, so that really is something that we all work hard at, because if we're doing what they're all doing on their own, then what's the point of the collaborative? And so what that work should be is always an area of creative tension.
Okay, thank you. As you know, I spent quite a bit of time looking at your website, and there's so much we could talk about just by perusing it, but we only have so much time today, and I'm wondering if you could share with us one or two Living Cities initiatives that you found or are finding to be particularly inspiring and impactful in terms of helping low-income people.
Sure. The first one is a body of work that's over the last few years kind of been termed collective impact. It didn't have that name when we started doing it a number of years ago, but it's this idea that the pace of change is just too slow, and that we're not able to get out of our way to actually get on a path to get dramatically better results for low-income people. At least in the U.S., if you look at income, if you look at wealth, if you look at educational attainment, especially for people of color, there has been very little gained in the last 40 years. And while there's been a lot of innovation, while there's been a lot of commitment, there actually hasn't been a lot of needle moving. And so one of the things that we set out to do about 8 years ago was say, could we find places around the country that were fed up with that pace of change, that had a critical mass of leaders from the public, private, philanthropic, and nonprofit communities that said, essentially, we need to work together differently. I think people associate this quote with, I've heard anything from Benjamin Franklin to Albert Einstein. I don't know who actually said it, but the definition of an insanity is that you keep doing the same thing over and over and expect a different result. And so what we said was, could we find leaders in cities across the country who want to actually try to solve these problems differently, and therefore have hope that we can get a very different result? And that our initial work in that is called the Integration Initiative, which is 7 cities across the U.S. where those leaders have come together and agreed on an ambitious result. New Orleans, for example, 50% of black men in New Orleans are unemployed or grossly underemployed, and they want to reduce that by 50% in 5 years. That kind of ambitious results you can't just do by the wave of a wand or the imposition of a new program that's funded by grants. That actually has to be many different people acting very differently. And that work, a similar approach we're doing with the Federal Reserve of Boston with the Working Cities Challenge, which is in smaller cities. Our work with the Integration Initiative is in big cities, 250,000 or above. Their work is in smaller cities in Massachusetts and soon in Rhode Island. But it's all, what can we learn about how to help leaders to come together and really get very different results. And that's one body of work that we're real excited about. And then the other one is that we really also believe that we have to help the public sector be able to work better and differently, use all the tools of the 21st century. But for too long, I think people said helping government get better results for its money and to be more innovative is not a charitable purpose. It's not something philanthropy should focus on, and we differ. We disagree with that. And so we've had an 8-year partnership with the Kennedy School at Harvard, the Ash Institute, where we bring chiefs of staffs to big city mayors together twice a year. It's called the Project on Municipal Innovation. And those chiefs of staff work with each other, help each other, challenge each other. We push ideas at them. They pull us up to ideas. And that body of work around public sector innovation I could talk about for quite a while this afternoon.
Well, I've gleaned 2 things from that. Those examples is one of the keys to being disruptive is finding people who are ready to be disruptive. That's how I interpreted you. Yeah, being tired of no progress. And the other one seems to be people who are willing to change their current drivers behind their work. So, when you mentioned, what charitable purpose perhaps it was seen as not something that would mean helping the government, it's crossing those lines of tradition or habit and looking at different ways of working together.
I think that's right, and I think you pick up on a really big point. One of our chief operating officer here at Living Cities, Ellie Baccarat, when she looks at our portfolio work, she'll say, actually, what we're really about is helping leaders change behavior, and I think she's right. It's leaders in a lot of different sectors. It's leaders in a lot of different roles, whether it's at the community level, whether it's at an institution, a foundation, a local government, a state government, federal player. The bottom line is, it's true one person can't change the world by themselves, but one person changing their behavior and the role of their institution in the system actually can have a disproportionate impact. And the leadership really, really does matter.
That's a great bridge to another question I have, Ben, because even when you bring together people who are ready for change, ready for disruptive change, we're all human beings, and we still bring our kind of resistance or the presence of our habits to the table, especially when we're faced with big change ideas and actions that will call upon us to change as individuals. So I think, it would be helpful to hear from you, what kinds of resistance did you face, even with those who were willing and excited to come to the table? And what advice can you give to our colleagues on how you might move through or around such resistance?
Sure. The change is hard. Change is disruptive. There are people everywhere who are benefiting from the current way things work. And also, almost everyone you work with in communities believes that, their heart is in the right place. And so it's not because of ill will, it's not negligence, it's just, in many cases, systems like the education system in the U.S. or the workforce development system, they were built for a very different economy and a very different time. And I use the example around education where, in the U.S., the schools are closed for the summer. And the reason they're closed for the summer is, based when we were an agrarian economy and they needed the kids to work the fields. Well, I have two kids who are now in their 20s, but when they were living at home, I can tell you they A, didn't work the fields, and B, they didn't even cut the grass. And so yet we still can't get past taking the summers off, and even though the evidence shows us that the amount of knowledge that's lost from kids between school years is phenomenal. It's huge. And so overcoming those those systems that have just been around forever that everyone takes for granted is really hard. And so I think what we found is, a few things. One is, like we just said, finding the champions locally is critical, leaders, and more importantly than one leader is more than one. And so redundancy when it comes to leadership matters. Ideally, you have a leader from the community, a leader from philanthropy, a leader from the government, and the more the better. The other thing, though, is that you have to have a big idea. One of my heroes and mentors was a great American named Jim Rouse. And Jim used to say, nobody gets behind small ideas. That you need it to be big and bold because people want to be a part of something important. And so I think you need to help people to come up with those big ideas. But then you also have to help them make them actionable and to get some small wins along the way, because saying we're going to change the world in 10 years, is not, people need to see success, much sooner than that. And then I think we found that data, and especially the ubiquity of data today, is really helpful in helping people to understand the problem and then to say, okay, now that I get the problem, I not only get the problem, but I can get the problem with particularity. So you may see in a city that 70% of the kids are reading by third grade, But when you break that down and you disaggregate by race, for example, what you'll likely see in many places in the U.S. is that 30% is actually 80% of kids of color, and actually coming from 3 schools. And so once you get that data, you actually can come up with strategies that can be way more successful than the sort of peanut butter strategies that are often used, where you just spread it, everywhere and hope for the best.
What I'm inferring from what you're saying is sometimes we forget how key it is to have the general public have a breadth and depth of understanding of what's really going on. So, we report, for example, in the newspaper, the unemployment rate is one number, but
right.
like you just said, in terms of education, if you dig into that number, you find, well, it's 25% of disabled people are unemployed, and more than that, Aboriginal and so forth. And when I've informed the public, for example, what welfare rates really are, they can't believe it because they never knew. They didn't know what it was like to live on such, or that people were being forced to live on such small amounts of money. So, under general public understanding is vital. It sounds like it's vital to your work. And then what really kind of clicked for me when you were talking about leaders from the community and philanthropy and other places is I'll invoke the collective impact word in a way that talks about collective leadership. Leadership's no longer just one leader doing stuff on her or his own.
No.
Well, let's move to kind of the economic question. So I believe, Ben, that one of the overarching barriers facing low-income people is that the economy does not work for the majority. I also believe bringing about economic change involves so much more than just shifting attitudes, but also involves crafting and implementing actual innovations that bring about economic change or shifting. Can you speak in the work that you're doing with others, how innovation, perhaps even disruptive innovation, can be a catalyst for economic change that benefits the community as a whole, but in particular low-income people?
Sure. I think and it's related to what we said earlier about leadership, but innovation is basically, it can come from everywhere and anywhere. And I think what we try to do is to support those innovators wherever they are, and to actually make sure that people get it, that it's actually not just the innovation comes from the top down, or that it only comes from the bottom up, but actually you want to support it from wherever it's coming. And you want it to be focused, not that it's going to just trickle down to low-income people and people of color, but there's actually intentionality behind what you're trying to innovate towards and for what purpose. And so, for example, there's just a number of different things that we've done and seen that are really encouraging. One is actually we just launched this week and invited cities in the U.S. to apply, but it's an initiative called Racial Equity Here. And it's riding an emerging trend in U.S. cities where cities are willing to put, or interested, eager to put a racial equity lens on all of how it operates. And so they look at the Department of Parks and they're like, what, do we have historical, institutional, or structural racism that is shown in the way that we run our parks, or the way that we collect revenue, or the ways that our housing and community development programs work. And it's sort of acknowledging that, again, we haven't made the strides we've needed to make, at least in our country, for hundreds of years. And we're going to have to work differently. So let's actually bring a different lens to the work, and not only say to kind of look at the data and tell us what it says, as my friend Jeff Edmondson from Strive Together would say, admire the problem, but move beyond the admiration and actually come up with a strategy for doing something about it, and then embedding it in future budgets so you actually fund the way government works to address the problems. Things of that nature. The other, there's a screen, on the screen is about our partnership with Bloomberg Philanthropies. And Bloomberg Philanthropies has been supporting this approach of helping cities build innovation delivery teams into the way they work. And they started in 5 cities where Bloomberg Philanthropies provided the city with some support to kind of staff up and train people on the way innovation happens. Not to tell them what you should apply it to, but to actually build the capacity to use innovation methodologies to solve whatever problem you're trying to solve. And so they started in 5 cities. All 5 of them at the end of the grant actually found the money, oftentimes from the city's own resources, to continue having people staff this work permanently. They've now expanded that work to 19 other cities in the U.S. and a couple in Israel. But what we're finding is that when you arm the employees with the tools to innovate and to challenge the status quo, they actually do it. You know, and it's that kind of thing as you get a critical mass of people who are saying essentially, we can take the risk because we've created a culture where risk is encouraged, and even failure if you've learned from that failure. And then finally, I'd say the other thing is it's really critical to be able to redirect capital towards things that are going to improve the lives of low-income people and connect them to the economic mainstream. And I'm happy to talk about that a lot. You know, so the emerging impact investor, new tools like Pay for Success and the like. But it's really, you know, kind of blending private capital and public and even individual good.
You know, when I'm listening to you, I find myself nodding my head up and down when you're talking about innovation. I mean, people are faced, you know, with the innovator's dilemma about how do you actually try to create new or big change approaches to things while you're continuing to do your current work because you're expected to. And one of the things that really stood out for me is the capacity building aspect of helping people learn how to innovate. It's not just an activity we all can just do because it's mundane. Innovation is hard. We need space to do it. It has cultural implications and certainly needs leadership supporting it and being okay with failing forward when failures occur, because they will. You know, let's carry that innovative kind of context and talk about your integration initiative, which I understand exists, you know, to be a catalyst for sustainable big change in cities, that benefits low-income people. And my understanding is that the initiative works to integrate collective impact, public sector innovation, and capital innovation to achieve transformative results. Can you say more about that? I think that's where you were headed anyway, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we've been at this work this will be our 25th year, you know, and we're a learning organization, and I think it's one of our strengths. You know, we actually are always reflecting on what is it that we're seeing out in the world from the people who are really doing the work, and how do we help them adapt, and how do we adapt what we do based on what's working or what the gaps are. And so over the years, so we launched the Integration Initiative in 2010, and so at that time we had, you know, 15 years or more of work, and what we realized was, number one, people had to learn how to work together differently to get better results. So let's support them to work together differently and learn about how that can really work. Number two, we really believe that you can't get the results you want unless the public sector is an active part of that collaboration, and that they have the capacity to be a good partner, and that, like I said before, too long we've ignored that sector, but they need as much capacity building as, you know, the traditional nonprofit that has been viewed as needing capacity building. So how do you make sure you bring them in there? And, you know, the reason why that's so important and such an often overlooked issue is that, you know, the public sector is a disproportionate funder of many of the systems that all of us are trying to fix. And so if you're not bringing the people who are disproportionate funded to the table, having them be a part of it, having them own the solution along with everyone else, you're hamstringing yourself. And then finally, if you really want to get dramatically better results for low-income people, I mean needle-moving results, not, you have a new job training program and you've helped 100 people when the demand is actually 150,000. If you're going to do that, you've really got to try to find solutions that can be supercharged with other capital other than grants. And not every solution can be, but more and more today, more can be. And so how can we harness the private sector to invest in this kind of results? How do we blend public money and philanthropic money to make it more attractive for the private sector to come in, or to bridge to the market where the private sector will come in? And so our idea was, how could we build something and find a coalition of the willing, a coalition of cities that wanted to experiment with us to understand how do all these things come together? What are the barriers for them working in concert for large-scale results? And then as we learn, we want to, what we call open sourcing the social change, which means tell people what we're learning, both good and bad, in real time. And so we don't wait for the 3 or 4 year evaluation to look back. We do that too. But we actually are very active in blogging and social media and speaking at conferences, talking as much about what hasn't worked as what has.
So Ben, I'm really curious about the word capital innovation. Do you have an example of how that's been put to work on the ground?
Yeah, sure. So there's kind of 2 ways. One is secured by real estate and one not. And in the U.S. at least, we have built an incredible capacity to be able to finance almost anything that can be secured by real estate. And Living Cities in our first 10 or 15 years of existence was one of the drivers of supporting the build out of that industry, the community development industry. And that was, how can we get something done in a long distressed, underinvested neighborhood that right now, the property's not worth the amount of money you would actually have to spend to fix it up, even after you fix it up. So how do you finance that? And if you never finance it and you never fix it up, then you never are on the road to community revitalization. And so we and others figured out, well, if you put philanthropic money at the bottom and take the first risk, and you put public sector money on top of it and take the second risk, you might de-risk it enough that the private sector will come in at the top. And over time, which is what we found, that amount of money underneath the private sector becomes less and less as the marketplace starts to stabilize. It doesn't work everywhere, but where it does. And finally, the market works on its own. And so, on the real estate side, we and others, quite a robust industry, community development industry in the U.S., have been really good at that. And the question was, is there any way that you could actually use those same concepts, that same tiered financing mechanisms to actually not just revitalize places, but help revitalize people? And one of the reasons that we've been excited about experimenting and investing in early stage pay for success, or some people call social impact bonds in the U.S., is that that's exactly what it is. The structure is very similar to the structure we used to use in affordable housing. The transactions take about as much time, years, as the early affordable housing deals did in the 80s and early 90s. But what you're seeing is a way for private sector folks to be able to actually invest in the success of low-income people and low-income communities. But it's that innovative layering and blending of different types of capital that makes it possible.
Well, Ben, we could talk for a long time about social impact bonds and social financing, all the new ways that that groups across both our countries are trying to find ways to finance. I'm so intrigued by that work, and did some work on that myself with the local provincial government here. we're just don't seem to be ready for that yet. So I think there'll be some lessons learned, and maybe we can talk later about that.
Absolutely.
But,
you know,
so before,
I was going to ask add one thing to Mark to that though. The other thing though that I like about it is even if it's early stage and there's only a handful that have been done, what we're finding is it does two other things, because I don't think it's a cure-all to getting better results. I think in many ways I call it the gateway drug for impact investors to really see how their money can make a difference in the lives of poor people and poor communities. And it rides the momentum of public sector folks who want to be innovative. And so it gives them something for both of them to build a relationship on. The reality is you can get better results without going through that whole structure. And some places are, but at least it's a kind of somewhat sexy way to get some of these early adopters to try this and to create these new relationships.
Thanks, Ben. I think we've got time for one more question before we open one more question of you before we open it up for others. So, I'm sure over the course of the life of Living Cities, there's been a good number of lessons learned. And, I recall reading a piece on the CNN Money site you wrote about Baltimore's attempt to address poverty. And I'm sure many lessons have embraced you and your colleagues in terms of designing and delivering collective impact initiatives. What are what might be 2 or 3 of the biggest lessons you've learned that have impacted your thinking and your work with cities?
Yeah. So, I think we've touched on some of them already today, but let me just kind of quickly highlight the ones I think maybe are most important. And the first one is you just have to stop doing the same things the same ways. There's just no way we're going to get anything but incremental change if we keep trying to solve the same problems largely the same way. Number 2, one of those ways is getting people to work together differently over the long term. And what we've learned is great idea needs help to keep and sustained. And that's this idea of supporting the backbone or the function of someone's job it is every day to get up and keep those people working together differently than they did before. The power of people going back and doing work the same way is just really overwhelming, and someone's job has to be to keep them working together differently. The third one is we really have to figure out how to intentionally bring other types of capital beyond grants and beyond public subsidy to the table. It adds more zeros to the solution, but it also just makes the problem, it distributes the ownership of the problem to more people in the community. Fourth one I'd say is what I talked about earlier is we really have to focus on helping government get better, helping government get more results for its money, and to ride the trend that I see all over the world in governments wanting to be that way. We just have to help them just like we have to help any other party who we've been helping in social change for years. And then finally I'd say that you really have to think about this as top-down and bottom-up, or some might say grass tops and grassroots. That I think we know that top-down has its limitations, but we also know, and need to be honest, that bottom-up does too. And so part of what we all have to figure out is how do we see both happen that isn't paralyzing, but that actually leads to dramatically better results for low-income people faster.
Thanks, Ben. Those are awesome lessons learned. I was typing as fast as I could on my notes. Thank you. Let's move now to the Q&A session part of our call. I'm sure our colleagues have questions they'd like to ask you. We have about 10 minutes or so to address these questions, and so I encourage people to submit your questions through your chat box in your go-to control panel, and Natasha will read your questions out for everyone to hear, and then we'll answer them.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yeah, we actually have a couple of questions to start with. And Ben, I wanted to thank you for talking about how you know, even just one person in their organization, or the role of just one person changing their attitudes and the way they work within an institution matters. And we actually had a question that kind of expands on that, working within existing systems. And their question is, can you speak more about how we do this work with existing systems compared to something that is new, and talk about, like, how do we do this while honoring existing coalitions, networks, etc. And how do those existing coalitions adopt and survive and stay relevant if they're not chosen to be the backbone organization?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So, you know, some of this work, I'd say it's important to suspend disbelief. It's one of my favorite terms. It's one that I know drives my staff crazy, because I think when you're at the beginning of a process like this, you have to suspend disbelief that it's not going to work, that the people are going to come to the table with the right frame of mind, that people are going to compromise as they need to compromise to make it all work. And so I think that's the first one. And then the second one is, if you are a leader of one of those organizations, you have to model that behavior and jump in and essentially, you know, assuming all of that is going to be the case. But I think that one of the things that we found is that getting the data about the problem is really important to do. Because oftentimes, like Mark was saying earlier, people don't necessarily know the problem. They may have a hunch. They may have even data that's just old. And so understanding the problem and then saying, okay, if this really is the problem, who are the critical players that need to be at the table to solve it? Oftentimes, because we can only get certain people to the table, we just assume that those are the people that have to solve it, even though they actually don't have the resources, the relationships, the political trust or will to do it. And you actually need to have different people at the table. So what's interesting, when we worked with the Boston Fed on the Working Cities Challenge, one of the elements of the challenge was the cities that were invited had to come to the application with one application for the whole city, meaning you couldn't come with 3 different ideas, one on workforce, one on education, one on poverty reduction. You actually had to get all the leaders to agree on what the biggest problem was, and then you had to explain why those leaders, public, private, philanthropic, nonprofit, were the right leaders that had to be at the table to actually solve the problem. And one of the cities came and said, you know, our people are grossly underemployed, but they literally had no employer at the table to solve the problem. It was essentially a group of service providers, you know, and it's not that they're not the right people, they're just not the only people. You know, they may be part of the solution, but not all of it. And so I think part of it is to really understand what problem you're trying to solve, and then who the right people are. And I think at times what people realize is, for the problem you're trying to solve today, certain institutions or entities make the most sense to play that role today, but it won't always necessarily be the case. You know, what we found is, one of our staff people who's been working on the integration initiative said, what's interesting is these cities start somewhere but end up going everywhere. Meaning, you may start in Minneapolis, St. Paul, dealing with transportation and the lack of ability to connect from job to home, but after you're well on your way to solving that problem, you then realize there's actually not enough jobs. Well, the people who need to be around the table to deal with transportation are mostly not the same people that need to be around job creation. And so the players, the partners, the table, and the backbone really has to have the ability to adapt and change.
Thanks. And that kind of speaks to something that one of our participants, Karen Gomez, is asking. So you're talking about the right innovators, and so she's asking, but what are the specific characteristics that shows these are the right innovators to support to generate change?
Yeah, and I apologize for I'm in New York City, so I think you could probably hear New York City behind me. Um, the So, I actually think that issue is a really good one. I think we are really not clear, those of us who are, care about social change, those of us who fund it, those of us who support it, actually are not really clear about what are the leadership characteristics that are needed to actually lead change in the 21st century, and then how do we help people to get those qualities. And it is one of the things that we're actually looking over the next few years to try to figure out how do we bring value to that area, because we ask people to lead. We talk about how important it is, but we don't actually give them the tools to do it. And I'm talking about people from every sector.
Great, thanks. And one of the other questions, this might be a harder one, but you've mentioned a lot about funding and funders and bringing them to the table and the different roles that they play. But one of our questions was, what's it like balancing that engagement of like political and legislative systems and doing that advocacy work while also balancing funders who might not be supportive of necessarily advocacy work?
Yeah. So I'd say we don't do traditional advocacy work because what we're really doing is sort of working with the people who are on the inside trying to solve the problems from within, as opposed to the people on the outside who are kind of knocking on the door and demanding that they fix it. And so there are a number of our member institutions who do that. And it's really important work, but what our kind of theory of change is, I guess, is that while that's happening on the outside, there's a whole lot of progress that could be made if the people on the inside actually decide that they are going to redirect the money and the resources that they control towards things that will work and get results without having to be to have people kind of knocking on their door and advocating against the way that they work. So our approach really is somewhat focused on how do we work with those sets of practitioners across sectors who actually want to change the way their own institutions show up in the solution.
Great, thanks.
We can't hear you, Natasha.
Oh, sorry. I'm talking on mute. And then I guess specifically then looking at cities in the municipal sector, which you talked a lot about too. One of the questions was, can you talk more about the continuity of initiatives like this when there's a change in leadership in the municipal sectors, specifically with the mayorship?
Absolutely. So, it's the continuity that is so critical because, as we all know, these problems weren't created overnight and we're not going to solve them overnight. They're probably a good decade-long process to really see, a material needle-moving change. And all of the pressures out there, from the way things are funded to the way how long people's terms are in office, or the head of a university, or there's so much short-termism out there. And so one of the things that we really encourage and try to support is this idea of multiple leaders in a place. So when one leader does move or change office or whatever, that you have some of that kind of redundancy and that their institutions stay at the table. But the other is to understand what could happen in the public sector to help that these innovations really become embedded in the work. And in fact, that is we have a partnership with City Foundation where we have a program called the City Accelerator. And the idea is that how do we help cities that are trying to solve the same problem work together and help each other, but also solve it in 18 months. And the idea was to find cities that have been on the cutting edge of innovation for a number of years, and where some of them are actually going to be changing elected leaders pretty much in the middle of our relationship with them. And we chose Nashville and Philadelphia, and then the third city was Louisville, who didn't change, but the other two did. And so we're literally seeing in real time, what did the prior mayor and the administration do to help keep that innovation and that culture of innovation stay. And what's interesting is, and the findings are not all that surprising. They're just, you have to be intentional. And one of them is, in Louisville, they've actually helped to define how you can build a permanent entity within the government that serves as a innovations resource for the other agencies. In Nashville, they've actually helped make sure that people within agencies were actually trained to be able to have innovation skills, and that would be not just political appointees, so that people with those skills would be spread out throughout the government. And then in Philadelphia, they said, let's just make sure that we build it into certain agencies first within the government that are most important, so they focused on finance and revenue, where the money goes. So I think you just have to be really intentional, and you have to help the leaders to be intentional about building in the infrastructure that makes it more likely, you can't guarantee it, but more likely that the innovations will stick.
Great, and then to follow up on that, actually, we have a similar question, and it's just about, so what are those first steps in those first conversations when you're trying to shift or alter long-standing traditions? So, for example, Vicki says, there's no school during the summer. So what are your recommendations for first steps or conversations for those who say it can't be done?
Yeah, well, the best example in my mind of that, and we see it all over, but one of the best and now oldest examples was what happened in Cincinnati, Ohio, about a decade ago. So they had unrest, racial unrest, not unlike Ferguson and Baltimore or whatever, but it was 12 years ago, or 10 or 12 years ago, and the community leaders came together and said, okay, this is a wake-up call. What are the biggest problems that we face as a community, and we got to do something about it. We can't just continue on business as usual, or this is going to be the way things, this community, this permanent face of our community. And so they literally, two leaders at the time, it was the head of the University of Cincinnati, Nancy Zimpher, who's now at the State University of New York, chancellor, and the head of a foundation there called Knowledge Works, and the community foundation, Kathy Merchant, and they basically said, let's go talk to all the other community leaders and ask them what do they think the biggest problem is that we're facing. And when they went and they talked to the leaders, almost everybody, whether it was number one or number two or number three, was we're failing our kids from cradle to career. And so then they said, well, if everybody thinks that's a problem, then we really need to do something about it. And they got the data that showed them where they were failing, before the kids even got to kindergarten. They couldn't read by third grade all the way up to they were going to college, they were incurring all this debt, and they still weren't getting a degree. And so they said, you know what? Who's responsible for getting results along that continuum? And then they mapped all the institutions, and it turned out the institutions who were responsible were the same people who had asked everybody, what the problem was. And so they sort of said, well, we found the enemy, and it is us. And so multiple leaders then began the process that has turned into this national movement, which is Strive Together, of 65 regions in the U.S. who are really tackling that problem from cradle to career.
Great, thanks. And I think we have time for just one more question. I have a shorter one here for you, Ben, and it's asking if there is one thing that hasn't been said yet that would help us reach a deeper level of understanding about backbone organizations, what would that be?
About backbones, did you say?
Yeah, one thing that hasn't been said yet about backbone organizations. To help us understand them at a deeper level, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's a unique skill set, and it may not be in one organization. I think it's healthy to think about it as a function, and that function is one that is responsible for continually collecting the data so people know what the problem is and whether or not there's any progress being made. Number two, that it keeps reminding the leaders of their responsibility and their shared responsibility to sit at the table. And so the table actually of these leaders has to be the leaders themselves, not their assistant and not their senior associate vice president. And they have to have the skill sets to be able to kind of have multiple masters, but help people to realize that it's only when they're working together and contributing what they can they actually get to the whole. And those, those are not easy skill sets, but they're also not a part-time job.
Ben, thanks so much. I'm listening to you, and again, I was trying to type as fast as I can. I need to take typing lessons, I guess. But this is the prompt here for me is to summarize everything you've said, and I'm thinking, how on earth would I do that? But a couple of things stand out for me. One is, complex problems have complex solutions, and it doesn't mean that by being complex it can't be done. It's just things are all connected. Structural racism is connected to poverty and perpetuates poverty. But some of the key things that I think impressed me about what you were talking about is it comes in words like collective impact, but also collective leadership. And I love the phrase you use, coalition of the willing. Yeah. And we spend a lot of time sometimes trying to convince those who aren't interested to come on and work with us when there's already many, many people who will and many groups that will. So coalition of the willing, what a powerful image that puts up, at least in my mind. And then, the integration of different ways of financing the work we need to do, because no funders working in stovepipes just aren't going to pull it off. And I could go on and on, but I'll encourage everyone on the line, and you'll get the information from us as we send out kind of the links and stuff from this interview. But go visit the Living Cities website, because there's so much there for you to learn about and to understand. But so, Ben, thanks so much for being a part of today's broadcast and sharing all the work you're doing and your wisdom, and thank you as well to all who attended. I have a few announcements before you leave, but and thanks so much, and I am certainly hoping our paths cross again.
Same here. Thank you for having me.
So for those still on the line, just a few quick announcements. And I'm sure you've heard of some of them before, but I want to stress the Cities Reducing Poverty When Mayors Lead event on April 5th and 7th. We have more and more mayors who are coming and agreeing to speak, whether in plenary or in workshops. Thought leaders like Cindy Blackstock, who just won won the case with the Human Rights Commission around equal rights for Aboriginal children. We have provincial, and we're working on trying to get federal minister to speak, city staff, city councilors, mayors, poverty advocates, Aboriginal leaders. It's going to be, I think, a milestone event in Canada. Never had so many mayors come together in one place to talk about poverty reduction in their community. So please email Natasha if you want more information, or visit our website at tamarackcommunity.ca. And there's also another webinar coming up around how Cambridge, Ontario has become the first Ontario municipality to adopt a living wage. So that's happening. When is that happening, Natasha?
March 15th.
March 15th, yes, sir, I didn't see it. So sign up, and it's going to be, we're going to have Alan Broadbent, the chairman of the Tamarack board, and Mayor Doug Craig and Councillor Pam Wolf in the city of Cambridge, talking about what led them to adopt a living wage and what they hope that will accomplish. If you're not yet a subscriber to the Vibrant Communities monthly newsletter, Cities Connect, I encourage you to do so, and you can sign up at our vibrantcommunities.ca website. So I guess that's it for today. We'll send you links to the audio and other materials in a day or two, and they'll be coming from Natasha. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks so much, Ben, again, for participating, and I hope you all have a great day.